Hello, Embertone fans. This is Alex Davis, and tonight I will be discussing the configure page from the Friedlander Violin. This one is the trickiest to understand, and there's a lot of important dials. I think that knowing about all of these controls will really help you unlock the flexibility of the instrument. So put your thinking caps on, and if you're anything like me, grab a cup of coffee, take a sip, and let's start talking about these controls. So these two dials, speed lower and speed upper, are at the center of the speed responsiveness script that we worked so hard to refine. And so let's just talk about them for a sec. The speed lower dial refers to transition lengths when you're playing slower, and the speed upper dial refer to transition lengths when you're playing faster. So if you set the lower at the very lowest setting and the upper at the very highest setting, what you're going to get is the highest level of flexibility from slow playing to fast playing, so that when you're playing really fast, the transitions get real short, and it feels really nice to have that sort of flexibility. And it's helpful to understand what the speed responsiveness script is by setting the dials to the same setting. I wonder if you could hear the difference there. You can definitely feel the difference, and it feels a lot more sluggish when everything is set to a slow speed. And conversely, it feels pretty unrealistic to have everything set to the highest speed as well. So you always want to have kind of a happy medium here, and that's why by default speed lower is set to 100%, which means when you're playing slowly, you're hearing the transitions at their natural speed. And then I think we set the speed upper to 200%, which means that when you're playing quickly, transitions are squeezed down to be twice as fast as they naturally are. And that allows you to play scales and arpeggios and all kinds of different figures faster, and so that it doesn't feel so sluggish. And just to emphasize, the speed does not change for the entire sample, it's just for the transition, and then it clicks back to the normal speed after a certain amount of milliseconds. So let's move on and talk about the normal speed knob. This dial will affect the sample after the transition. So if you set the normal speed to 150%, it's going to make that sustain that follows the transition a lot faster. More typically, I think the normal speed dial can be brought below 100%, and that allows you to stretch the sample if you don't want to get to a rebow too soon. If you get too far below 60% or even 65%, the results start to sound a little bit stretched, but just to highlight my point, you can check it out at 25%. You can hear that stretched sound. But if you bring the dial to about 60 or 70%, you might get a little more bang for your buck, and you can elongate that sustain that follows the transition and still not have the sound be too stretched out. And I should also mention that since our vibrato is scripted, the vibrato is not tied to the speed of the sample, since it's all created with modulations and stuff under the hood. So let's get the normal speed back to 100%. That's where we really do prefer it. And then let's move on to the next topic, which is the transition attenuation. If the transitions are getting in the way, if there's one that sticks out, or in general, if you don't want such loud transitions from note to note, you can move this dial up and it will make the transition's quieter. It's really a subtle difference, but if you bring the dial all the way up to negative 20 dB, you can really hear it. I should also mention that if you have an iPad and you have Touch OSC, you can control the transition level from the interface. So using CC data within your sequence, you could change the transition attenuation according to what you want on a note-by-note basis. It doesn't have to be a static setting. All right, moving on. Bow noise reduction is a big feature that we worked really hard to get. And essentially, it was because of VI control. Someone was mentioning that in one of the original demos, bow noise was too prominent. So especially when you play up higher in the register. Can you hear that scratchy bow sound? So we worked really hard to isolate bow noise on every separate note. And this is what you get. I think bow noise reduction is really helpful to have when you're using a lot of reverb. It doesn't make a lot of sense to have a lot of bow noise because if you were listening to someone like a violinist playing in a church or something, and you were sitting 20 or 30 feet away, you wouldn't be hearing a lot of bow noise. So it kind of takes you out of the moment when you're listening to a violin sound with a whole lot of reverb, but a whole lot of bow noise at the same time. So if you want that intimate close-up sound and you don't have any reverb on it, let me turn reverb off. If you want that really intimate sound, then you can have the bow noise. It's really nice. That realistic scratchy sound. But if you have a lot of reverb going on, you might want to consider bringing this dial up so that it sounds as if the violinist is actually far away. You wouldn't hear the bow noise. I think I made that point, so let's move on. I'm going to take another sip of coffee. Okay. Intonation is a fun setting that I like to play with. And what it does is pretty simple. It just randomizes intonation for every note. So if you set it to 3 cents here, then it's just going to be varying up and down by 3 cents. I'm going to turn the reverb down. So if you set it to 200 cents, that means it's going to vary a whole lot. I think it's nice to have a low setting here, just so that notes don't remain static. Just depends on the sequence that you're working on. Sometimes you want the tuning to be perfect, and then you could just bring intonation down to 0. But a low setting here will give you an organic result. So we've covered now the first 6 dials. Let's dive straight in to the short dynamic controls. So I'm going to switch over to staccato mode. Okay, you have the choice of making the short notes responsive to velocity. So the harder I press down, the louder samples are triggered. But you can also change that to make dynamic CC controlled. So now I can use CC11, or really whatever CC you specify, to trigger softer and louder samples. So that means when I'm playing harder and softer on the keys, it's not having an effect on the samples. So here's another really important point about velocity and dynamic control over the short samples. When it's velocity controlled, The dynamic CC, which I've made in this situation, CC11, will change the length of the staccatos. This is a great feature that we discovered at the very last minute. So that means when I bring the dynamic CC up, I'm hearing longer staccato samples. And when I bring it down, it's triggering really short samples. I'm going to bring just a little bit of reverb in there. Okay, so then the opposite happens when I click the dynamic CC button. Dynamic CC now brings you from the quiet to the loud samples, but velocity controls the length, which is kind of cool. So that when you play quiet velocities, you're getting really short samples. I should say when you play soft or gentle velocities, and then when you play harder on the keys, it makes the samples longer. So all that control is really cool, but if you don't prefer it, just click length control, and all of that length business that we were just talking about, all that goes away, and you can just have a static length of staccato notes. The next control that we can talk about is release samples. That's really simple. If you like release samples, then keep it on. They're very subtle. If for some reason you don't want to have release samples, you can turn that off, and when you release a note, no sample will be triggered. Next, we're going to talk about the portamento velocity threshold. So here's another big bit of information. Portamentos by default are velocity controlled. So you set the velocity threshold. So if it's set to 127, everything you play will be a portamento. And when you set it lower, just everything below that value will be a portamento. Beyond that, though, what's really interesting is that when you play a very soft transition, you're going to get a slower portamento, and when you play with a higher velocity, as long as you're below the threshold, it's going to make for a faster portamento. So here's a really soft one. So that's a slow portamento. And then when I play below the threshold but with more force, it makes the portamentos faster. It's a really cool, and I think it's a pretty intuitive way of controlling portamento speed. But if you don't prefer that and you want a higher measure of control, you can switch that to dynamic CC, and a magic dial will appear. By default, it's set to 100%. So now velocity does not control the speed of the portamentos. Now this knob does, and by default, it's CC 80. And also, it's on our magical Touch OSC control so that you can make the speed as low as 75% and as high as, I think, 300%. So when the dial is all the way down, portamentos are real slow. And when the dial is up, you get that nice, fast portamento. Well, now my throat is dry from all the talking, but I hope that this helped, and we will continue with the control page next. Thanks.